We're on page 67, improved SEO with mod rewrite. Okay, and they mention some of the advantages you have with your single page site. All right, easier to maintain, easier to expand. I already mentioned those, but they say again the downside is what you see with what they call these awkward URLs. All right, so it says the standard solution to this is to do mod rewrites, and what you're able to do with mod rewrites, for lack of better words, is you're able to change internally what the person sees externally on their screen. All right, and the way that you do this in many ways, if anyone in here, and I don't know what your experience level may or may not be, but if anyone in here has ever done any work where you've worked with Unix or Starnix, whatever they want to call it, when you're working with command line type of stuff, that's more similar to what this is. The big thing I'll tell you is what the author says right here. See that tip? To be safe, I'd recommend making a copy basically of any file that you're working with. So not if you screw it up, but when you screw it up, you can go back to the original. All right? You can say that till you're blue in the face, but some people, that's okay. I won't make any mistakes. Okay, well, that's a good way to learn that. All right, and they mention here, it says when you do this, you can do it in two ways. You can edit the primary Apache configuration file, or you can create directory-specific files. The primary configuration file is this one. Okay, and if I grab this, go to the C drive, go to XAMPP, okay, and I search for that file. Of course, it doesn't have it. httpd.conf, I think that's what it is. It's in here in a bunch of spaces. I'm going to look at the one right here. All right, it looks somewhat like your ini file. As you'd probably guess, anything with a pound sign that's in there, anything with a pound sign is a comment, or it's a feature that's turned off. So you can see that this load module is turned on, the one underneath it is turned off. That makes sense because it's got the pound sign in front of it. All right, and what you are able to do, and I wouldn't do this, typically this isn't something you do yourself. This is something that for example, an admin person would do. All right, you can do things like this. All right, you can specify directories, and when you specify directories, you can say whether or not you're going to allow the user to override what's there naturally, or you're not going to. So notice here it's all allow override none. You can't override anything. All right, the opposite of none would be all. That's really dangerous. You don't normally see that, but it can be done, and they're going to talk about the different things that are in here. Usually what you do is when you set up something like this is you deny everything. You don't allow anybody to do anything. Then you come in between lines like this or underneath this, and you come in and you check the person's qualifications. In other words, what are they authorized to do? And if they have a certain authorization, you might then allow them to do certain things. All right. So there's a lot of work, again, that's going on behind the scenes for you to be able to do this stuff. All right. So the author mentions that if you use the http d.conf file, you only have to change it in one place. If you use the other one, which is the .htaccess file, as it says, it's placed within a web directory, and you're going to have to sit there and either copy it to different places or turn it on and turn it off more often, because the one that's in blue right now is global to the site, and the other one, the htaccess, basically is going to be local to the site. In other words, it's going to be only for a file or for whatever. All right, so he recommends that you use that one. Does everybody know this? The author mentions this in here, that anything special about that file, .htaccess, anything special about that file? Does it look weird as opposed to most files you see, and why? Well, how about this? It has nothing before the dot. So it looks like it's just a big extension. You know, like you create a batch file, it's myfile.bat. Well, this doesn't have anything. When you don't have anything, when a file starts with a period like this, it's a hidden file. All right, you won't see it unless you turn stuff on to be able to look for it. Bless you. All right, so he goes in here and he talks about, bless you, how you can allow HT access, overrides, and the stuff you have to do. All right. So again, he goes through the steps in here and he says, if you want to allow overrides, these are the ways that you could do it. Again, these are the two extremes, everything and nothing. And as it says, there's an auth config for using authorization and authentication, what I told you before. So the system would actually then go up and look, based on your login, you'd have privileges, and based on those privileges, what you can and can't do. Well, yes, it's kind of some of the stuff we did in Joomla, yeah. And again, it's kind of the same way that if I log in and Mark logs in, I've got access to the J drive and a bunch of other drives that he doesn't have access to. All right, same kind of thing. File info, as it says, for performing redirects and URL rewriting, which is what they talk about here. Indexes for listing directory contents, limit for restricting things, and you can set up certain options. This is pretty heavy stuff, as you might guess. So you go and you open up that file. It says at the end of the file, add this, and where it says path to directory, that's not what you'd put in there. It would be something like c:\\xamp /htdocs. All right, and you could be even more than that. You know, for instance, we could say /Chapter02. All right, or something like that. And he goes through the steps and all the stuff that you would do. All right, it says allow override all, and notice what he says here. This is a heavy-handed solution, but will do the trick. On a live, publicly available site, you better not do that. All right? The more stuff you make available for anyone, that means if a hacker can come in and steal a session or do whatever where the system thinks you're that person, and if you give them unlimited privileges, it's just as though you did do it. All right? So he goes through that. There's some really good stuff in here as far as, you know, he reads. Yeah. There's a big thing on the news the other night that in the Rockford area there have been 14, since January 1st, there have been 14 people stealing cars. And I think they said in 11 of the cases, the person had their car started, they were in the house, the car was started, there was no remote starter, and it wasn't locked. And I listened on the news last night when Chet Epperson, who is the police chief, said how they have the best detectives in the nation in Rockford, which I didn't know, but since he said it, it must be true. But the other thing is, going along with that, as far as I know, on these 14 cars that were stolen, none have yet been recovered. Okay. So he goes through the steps of doing this, okay? And notice what he's got here. This is the whole page is gray here on page 70. Protecting directories. It says another common use is to protect the contents of a directory. Well, again, it can be very painstaking to go and on a file-by-file basis to give people rights or non-rights. It's easier to give them, to do it on a directory basis or folder basis. The problem with doing that is, again, if somebody manages to get in as you, and you give them access to everything that's in the folder, in essence, they're now you. So he talks about this, and this was some of the stuff that I talked about before. You know, sometimes you deny everything and then you start to allow things. I have done work with this back in when I was working at AT&T. We did this stuff all the time. It was second nature. It's not hard once you've done it for a while, but it's different. All right. So the last part of the chapter, starting on page 71, and I guess the second last part, sorry, they talk about caching also, but here they talk about enabling URL rewriting. It says, finally we get to where we want to go. All right, it says it's gained attention as part of the overbearing focus on search engine optimization. And if you read a lot of Ullman's stuff, he's funny because he tends to have the attitude, from what I can tell, and I agree with him in many ways, that people are spending too much time nitpicking and worrying about stuff that in the end doesn't matter all that much. And nobody's really taking a look at how little by little everything is going to hell. It's kind of like a person who, you know, kind of like me, where I'm starting to let my gut again go to hell. All right, but it's a person like that. They've got not me, but they've got perfect hair, but the rest of them is terrible because they're just concentrating on one thing and all they care about is their hair or whatever. It's the same kind of thing. That's kind of how he feels with URL rewriting. It's like, wow, is it really that bad for somebody to be able to see this, as opposed to www.example.com/category and then maybe like /hats or something like that. All right, and that's what he's getting to in here. All right, and first he tells you one way of doing it, but he says this is one way you can do it. You can actually write it like code, and he tells you what to do, and then he says, let me be clear, you really shouldn't do that. But it's one thing that you sometimes see people do, but you shouldn't. You end up doing things like this. You end up creating rules. And where I said before, this is very much like something you saw last semester, even if you don't agree. All right? This looks a lot like regular expressions. And when you think about it, that's what this is. All right, it says start with category. Under category, you can have one or more numbers. After that, you can have basically anything. All right? And category.php, an ID equals 1, which will end up being the first argument that's in there. Now, you might say, yeah, fine, Jeff, clear as mud. Again, underneath this, he explains what's happening in every single step that's going on in here. Right? But again, the idea is what I showed you earlier when I brought up the thing from the Blackhawk site, that it would be much easier rather than having that huge query string to just have it say what it was, which was 152-142. All right, that's what people are shooting for with this stuff. So he goes through an example, and he goes through everything that's in here much better than I ever could. Then he talks about implementing it. I didn't try doing this. All right. So they tell you to create a new file and basically go in there and jazz it up, so to speak. And this might be why my stuff didn't work. I don't know. All right. I got it to work a little further than his stuff itself worked. All right, but mine didn't. And notice what he says in here. This is where I thought, he says, well, if you do it and everything worked okay, that's what your site should look like. If you didn't do it or it doesn't work okay, that's what your site should look like. That's what mine looks like. And the one I put out there, that's what it looks like. All right, now to the last thing in the chapter. Starting on page 75, they talk about browser cache. All right, it says web browsers and proxy servers habitually cache web pages. As it says, it's a matter of storing the content or part of it and then bringing that up. In other words, the reason that you cache is you want to minimize the number of jumps that you make to a server. All right. So in other words, if I sit there and go out to CNN.com and I download a video, it may cache that video. So if I go out to CNN.com again, it can bring the video up faster, that rather than grabbing it from CNN.com, it grabs the cache version that it's saved for me. Something like that. And that's what they're talking about in here. So he says for most end users, this is not a problem. If done properly, the end users won't be aware of whether they're using the cache version or not. This is becoming really even more important because with a lot of the stuff with HTML5, all right, the way that it's set up right now, you can set up a website, and you can set up a website so that if a person sits there and, for example, this morning we had problems. They rebooted one of the servers this morning. You could still get to the internet, but you've had that happen before. You go out, whether it's here or at home, you go out to the internet and it says cannot connect or whatever. All right, but there are times where you can go out to a site, and even if you don't have internet connectivity, you can still go out to the site and get certain information. And that's information that they decide basically to cache, and they decide to put out there where you don't need internet access to get there. All right. Now, with that said, if it's Amazon's not going to do that. But if you've got a real simple site, you might want to put your main page out there, and if somebody gets to it that way, you might let them know, well, there's a problem right now, but please come back because this is the stuff we have available or whatever. And that's kind of what he's talking about in here. All right. He says here, caching both in web browsers and proxy servers can be affected by the use of the header function. You may or may not remember this, but we did talk about it last semester. All right, when you use the header function, for lack of better words, it's kind of like a go-to. It allows you to literally go from one page to another page. There's other certain ways you use it too, but that is one of the ways. And it says there's 4 header types that are involved with caching. Last modified, hopefully that makes sense, the last time you modified something. Expires, typically with caching, it depends on the site. And again, I think I've given you this talk before, so I don't want to waste your time. But how long are you going to cache something in Amazon? Well, if I'm going out there and I'm looking at books, and I'm going to maybe buy a used book that they have out there on Amazon, all right, it may cache something, but it may update the cache every 30 seconds to a minute. Why would it do that? In case somebody else buys that book. All right. On the other hand, if it's a intranet site for a company and it's just being used internally, you might find that you may be able to cache at the beginning of the day, and by the next day, you might be able to keep it cache all day, depending. It depends on a lot of stuff. All right. So it says there, the first 3 are part of the HTTP standard. Last modified uses the date time value. All right, expires as an indicator as to when the cached version of the page should no longer be used. In other words, when you go back and get the, quote, real page, unquote. Pragma, as it says, there is just a declaration of how the page should be handled. In other words, if you want to make sure they don't cache, you could put that in, which says you always get the latest and greatest. Most people are willing to put up with caching some of a site for 2 reasons. First, they don't know what's happening. And second, they get their stuff faster. And as it says, the cache control header was added in HTTP 1.1, and it's a more finely tuned version. Okay, I'm not going to read these. You can see the different, as it says, there's some of the different directives that are available. Okay, so he talks about, he has you come through here and play a little bit with caching. All right, I did very little with this, just so you know. He even sets how long you're going to cache for, etc. That's pretty much it for the chapter. I figured it'd be around 11:30 when we finished. All right. So again, in the next class on Tuesday of next week, all right, we'll go through chapter 3. I don't know if there's any of you in here, and I'm just saying this, and you might well be like, duh, but if any of you have classes on Mondays, you do know the school's closed Monday, right? That said, that's a lie, just so you know. The school probably is going to be open. But to my knowledge, you won't be able to get into this room. All right. I got asked by the BCD, the Business and Community Development people. They wanted to use these 2 rooms for Excel training on Monday. So they're opening up the institution. So I believe these 2 rooms are going to be both filled with people that are going to have Excel training in here. That's what I'd heard, unless it's changed. All right. So I don't know. Technically, they're not. The school is supposed to be closed on Monday because if they're going to do that and bring those people in, I guess by law they have to have a custodian here, and you can't have the school open without a custodian. So they must be bringing a custodian in. Custodians probably love it because they get holiday pay then. All right, so you can try coming in here Monday, but I don't think you're going to be able to. And that completes chapter 2.